Imagine being at a family celebration, laughter, decorations, the smell of cake drifting through the air, when, in the span of just a few minutes, everything turns to horror. That's what happened one summer evening on the quiet shores of Crystal Key, Florida, when a 14-year-old girl named Leila Monroe followed her pregnant mother, Rebecca, out onto the deck of their beach house, and only one of them came back inside. What looked like a tragic fall at first soon revealed something far darker, a secret rage, a hidden resentment, and a murder that would shatter not just one family, but an entire community. This isn't just the story of a crime. It's a haunting look into the mind of a teenager torn between love and jealousy, and how a misunderstanding grew into something no one saw coming. Because when the truth finally came out, it wasn't just shocking, it was soul-crushing. Before we dive in, if you appreciate deep real-life stories like this one, where every twist feels stranger than fiction, make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. It helps our channel grow and lets us keep bringing you powerful true crime documentaries every week. Now, let's uncover how one summer celebration turned into one of the most chilling family tragedies in Florida's history. The house at the edge of Crystal Key had been chosen for its beauty, not its silence. A wide, stilted beach home painted in soft pastel blues and trimmed with white shutters. It sat where the ocean met the mangroves, surrounded by the rhythmic pulse of waves and wind. To anyone passing by, it looked like the kind of place people came to heal, a sanctuary for family reunions, weddings, or the kind of small-town celebrations that left lasting memories. But on that sweltering July afternoon, it would become the setting for something else entirely, something that no one in the Monroe family would ever forget. Inside, the smell of buttercream and sea salt filled the air. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings as guests moved between the kitchen and living room, balancing paper plates and glasses of lemonade. A welcome baby Oliver banner stretched across the fireplace, a cheerful splash of blue and white surrounded by tiny paper sailboats and seashell garlands. Rebecca Monroe, 7 months pregnant and glowing with the kind of joy that only comes after years of heartbreak, was the heart of it all. She had spent weeks planning this baby shower down to every small detail, the nautical cupcakes, the tiny anchor charms tied around the napkins, even the choice of a centerpiece, a decorative lighthouse statue that sat proudly on the mantelpiece. Rebecca had always been sentimental. That lighthouse wasn't just decor, it was symbolic. Years ago, her husband Daniel had given it to her as a housewarming gift when they first moved to Crystal Key. It's a reminder, he'd said, that no matter how stormy things get, we'll always find our way back home. The irony of that statement would linger like a ghost in the years to come. Guests milled about, chatting about nursery colors and baby names, passing around ultrasound photos where tiny hands and feet were clearly visible. Rebecca's sister, Claire, was the host of the day, orchestrating games and laughter with practiced ease. But among the smiles and celebrations sat one person who didn't seem to belong to the moment. Leila Monroe, Rebecca's 14-year-old daughter. She sat alone on the couch, her phone resting face down beside her, her expression caught somewhere between disinterest and quiet irritation. Every time her mother unwrapped a gift, another layer of her composure seemed to peel away. A blue onesie, a stuffed giraffe, a soft baby blanket embroidered with the name Oliver. Each one drew a chorus of coos and compliments from the guests. And each one to Leila was a reminder of how everything in her life had started to revolve around that unborn baby. To the others, her distance looked like teenage aloofness, the normal kind. A girl simply too old for baby showers, too cool for family games. But under that still surface, something darker was stirring. Leila had been quiet for months now, withdrawn. The kind of quiet that didn't come from shyness, but from a growing sense that she was being pushed out of her own family. Rebecca had tried to fix it, mother-daughter, movie nights, beach walks, even signing up for a pottery class they could take together, but nothing seemed to reach her anymore. Every conversation ended with a shrug or a slammed bedroom door. That evening, as the sun began to lower over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and coral, Rebecca stepped out onto the deck to catch her breath. It had been a long day of laughter and attention, the kind that can be both joyful and exhausting. She stood with her hands resting gently on her belly, feeling the rhythmic flutter of baby Oliver's kicks beneath her fingertips. Almost there, she whispered softly to herself. We're almost there. Inside, Leila watched her mother through the glass door. For a long moment, she didn't move. The chatter in the room faded into background noise, a blur of voices that no longer included her. Then, almost absently, she stood up. No one noticed as she walked to the mantel, her gaze falling on that ceramic lighthouse. She picked it up, held it in her hands for a few seconds, and set it back down, as if testing the weight of a thought she couldn't yet name. A few seconds later, she slid open the door and stepped outside. The security camera on a neighboring property, a grainy wide-angle feed, would later show what happened next. Rebecca stood facing the water, unaware of her daughter approaching from behind. Leila's figure appeared briefly in the corner of the frame, her movements small, almost hesitant. Then, the camera lost sight of them both behind the wooden railing. 4 minutes later, The door slid open again, and Leela reappeared alone. Back inside, she moved quietly through the room, her face calm, her steps measured. She poured herself a glass of lemonade, sat back down, and rejoined the party as if nothing had happened. When Rebecca didn't return for some time, no one thought much of it. "She's probably just taking a walk," Leela said when someone asked. She said she needed a break. It wasn't until nearly 2 hours later, when the last sliver of sunlight had faded and the air outside had cooled, that Daniel began to worry. He stepped out with a flashlight, calling his wife's name into the dark. At first, there was only the sound of the tide and the cicadas. Then, as he aimed the light toward the rocks below the deck, the beam caught something pale against the jagged stones. It took a few seconds for his brain to understand what he was seeing. Rebecca, her blue maternity dress was torn, her limbs twisted at impossible angles, her hair darkened with blood. For a moment, Daniel froze, the world narrowing to the sound of his own breathing. Then, he screamed her name, a sound so raw it sliced through the night and sent everyone rushing outside. Guests ran down the stairs, some crying, others praying. As Daniel knelt beside his wife's body, he begged her to wake up. He pressed his fingers to her pulse, but deep down, he already knew. When the paramedics arrived, the scene looked like something out of a nightmare. Flashing red and blue lights reflected off the water, casting eerie patterns on the deck above. They tried CPR, but it was hopeless. Both Rebecca and her unborn baby were gone. At first, the police treated it as a tragic accident. The deck railing was tall, but perhaps Rebecca had leaned too far over, lost her balance. Maybe the baby shifted suddenly and caught her off guard. These were the explanations that made sense, the ones people clung to because the alternatives were unthinkable. Inside the house, Lila sat quietly on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. She looked stunned, pale, hollow-eyed. Her aunt tried to comfort her, mistaking her calmness for shock. "She's in denial," someone whispered. "She doesn't understand yet." But what investigators would later say still chills anyone who hears it. Lila understood perfectly. That night, Detective Nathan Sloan arrived at the scene. He was a seasoned investigator with a reputation for catching details others missed, the kind of man who didn't believe in coincidences. As he walked the property with his flashlight, he noticed how intact the railing was. No broken wood, no scratches, no blood on the outer edge. That was strange, he thought. For someone to fall from that height, there should have been some sign of struggle or contact. Still, he kept those thoughts to himself. It was too early to jump to conclusions. He watched as the forensic team photographed the deck, bagged Rebecca's belongings, and marked the blood trail below. At around midnight, he stepped inside the house to speak with the family. Lila was sitting beside her father, her small frame swallowed by a thick sweater. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady. She said she wanted to take a walk. She told him she needed some air. "She does that sometimes." Sloan nodded, writing in his notebook. "Did you see her go?" Lila hesitated just a fraction too long. "Yeah," she said finally. "She went toward the beach." The detective's pen paused. "And you didn't follow her?" "No," Leela said, shaking her head. "I stayed inside." It was a small lie, but one that would unravel everything. When dawn broke over Crystal Key, the beach house was eerily quiet. The decorations still hung in place, the half-eaten cake sat untouched, and the word baby from the banner had fallen to the floor, curling slightly at the edges. Outside, seagulls circled above the shoreline where Rebecca's body had been found. The tide was rising, washing over the rocks where her blood had stained the surface just hours before. Detective Sloan stood on the deck, staring at the horizon. Something about the scene wouldn't leave him alone. His gut told him there was more to this story, something deliberate, something personal. He turned to one of the forensic techs and said, "Bag everything, especially the stuff from the mantel." And that's when they noticed it, the lighthouse statue. It looked pristine, almost unnaturally clean compared to the rest of the dusty decor. No fingerprints, no smudges, not even a hint of dust on its smooth ceramic surface. For an object that had been sitting out all weekend, that was unusual. The tech lifted it carefully, shining a flashlight across its surface. "This thing's been wiped," he said quietly. Recently Sloane's eyes narrowed. "Get it tested." The rest of that day unfolded like a slow, haunting unraveling. The beach house, once filled with the sound of laughter, became a sterile crime scene lit by flood lamps and camera flashes. Family members were sent to a hotel, the deck was cordoned off, and every inch of the living room was photographed and catalogued. And somewhere in that chaos sat Lila Monroe, silent, expressionless, and, to the trained eye, far too calm for a girl who had just lost her mother. What no one yet knew was that the truth about Rebecca Monroe's fall had already been written, not in witness statements or police reports, but in the faint traces of blood that clung to the grooves of that decorative lighthouse. A secret waiting to be uncovered. Because sometimes, the clues that solve a murder aren't loud or obvious. Sometimes, they sit quietly in plain sight, as innocent as a piece of home decor, as fragile as the bond between a mother and her daughter. And by the time the truth came to light, the question haunting everyone wouldn't be how Rebecca died, but why Lila had done it. The night that followed the celebration fell heavy and strange over Crystal Key, as if the air itself understood that something irreversible had happened there. The sea.com, only hours earlier, seemed to turn restless beneath the moonlight, its rhythmic pull against the rocks echoing the quiet tension that now surrounded the Monroe Beach house. What had been, just that afternoon, a place of laughter and promise now stood hollow and unrecognizable, a shrine to something once warm that had turned instantly cold. The guests were gone, taken away by police escorts in shock. The food sat untouched on the counters, the decorations drooped in the humid air, and the faint scent of vanilla frosting still clung stubbornly to the room where tragedy had taken place. Outside, the deck where Rebecca Monroe had last stood was silent except for the sound of the wind moving through the wooden railings. The scene below was lit by the pulsing red and blue flashes of emergency lights that painted the rocks and shoreline in surreal color. The responding officers moved with quiet precision, marking evidence, securing boundaries, their voices low, as though raising them might disturb the fragile line between order and grief that still held the place together. Rebecca's body had already been taken away by the coroner's team, but the image of her lying there, her blue dress torn and darkened, her body contorted by gravity and violence lingered in everyone's mind. No one who saw her that night would ever be able to forget. Daniel Monroe stood alone near the edge of the deck, motionless, his flashlight still in hand even though it no longer served a purpose. He looked out over the water without really seeing it, unable to reconcile the scene before him with the memory of his wife standing in the same spot just hours earlier, laughing softly as she felt their unborn son kick inside her. In the brief space between those two moments, his world had folded in on itself, and now there was nothing left but the echo of that loss. Around him, the investigators moved quietly, careful not to disturb the man who had just lost everything. The early theory was simple, too simple, perhaps, a tragic fall, a misstep from the deck that had cost a woman and her unborn child their lives. There were no witnesses to contradict it, no signs of forced entry, no immediate reason to suspect foul play. The beach house stood at a height that made such an accident possible, if not common, and the jagged rocks below could have easily turned a simple slip into a fatal event. That was what the reports would have said, had the investigation ended there. But even in those first few hours, small inconsistencies began to whisper otherwise. Detective Nathan Sloan, experienced and methodical, was not the kind of man who ignored whispers. He had been called in late that evening from the nearby Marathon precinct, his reputation built on his ability to notice what others overlooked. When he arrived, the air was thick with salt and grief, the kind of atmosphere that clings to the skin. He moved through the scene in silence, his flashlight cutting narrow beams through the darkness, tracing along the railing, the floorboards, the overturned chair near the deck's corner. The details spoke softly but clearly to those who knew how to listen. The railing was unbroken, the boards solid and clean, showing no indication that anyone had stumbled or fallen over in panic. There were no drag marks on the outer edge, no splintered wood that might suggest a struggle. The surface, though, carried faint, almost invisible smudges, the kind that looked like they had been hastily wiped, as though someone had tried to erase something without realizing the effort would only draw attention. Down below, near the rocks, the medical examiner conducted a preliminary assessment. The injuries were severe, but something about them did not fit the pattern of a fall. There was a distinct wound to the back of Rebecca's head, one that bore a curvature and depth inconsistent with the sharp, uneven texture of the stones beneath her. It looked like something blunt had struck first, something with weight and form, and the blow, from the angle and the force, appeared deliberate, though it was too soon to declare it murder. The possibility hung in the air like humidity, impossible to ignore. By the time dawn began to break, the soft light of morning revealing the disarray left behind by chaos, the Monroe home felt suspended between two realities: the image of domestic peace it had represented just 24 hours earlier and the grim uncertainty of what it had now become. The forensic team continued its slow, deliberate sweep through every room, collecting fingerprints, cataloging items, and photographing every object that seemed even remotely out of place. It was during this careful process that one detail drew their attention more than any other: the lighthouse statue sitting untouched on the mantel. To the untrained eye, it was unremarkable, a decorative piece, cream-colored with soft blue accents, about a foot tall, perhaps something a family might pick up from a seaside boutique. Yet to the investigators, its pristine appearance was what made it stand out. Everything else in the room carried the faint residue of life: fingerprints, dust, tiny imperfections from use. But the lighthouse looked too clean, its surface oddly reflective under the morning light, its edges wiped smooth. When one of the technicians lifted it carefully with gloved hands, the base felt faintly sticky, the kind of tackiness that suggested a recent cleaning with something damp. It was bagged immediately, its potential significance unknown but impossible to dismiss. As the technician sealed it in evidence tape, the irony did not go unnoticed. A lighthouse, symbol of safety and guidance, now potentially the key to unlocking an act of unspeakable violence. Meanwhile, in a nearby hotel, the surviving family members were being held for questioning and observation. Daniel was inconsolable, alternating between stunned silence and restless pacing, replaying the evening again and again in his mind, looking for something he might have missed, a sign, a sound, a glance that should have told him what was coming. He could remember the moment his wife had stepped outside, the soft scrape of the sliding glass door, the way she had smiled before disappearing into the amber glow of the sunset. He could also remember how normal everything had felt after that, how his daughter had sat quietly with the others, eating cake, laughing faintly at her aunt's jokes, showing no sign of unease. The timeline made no sense to him, and yet he couldn't bring himself to question it. Not then, not yet. For the detectives, however, the investigation was already shifting direction. They began piecing together Rebecca's final moments, reconstructing her movements through witness statements and the surrounding surveillance footage from neighboring properties. It was from one of those cameras, a small, grainy security system mounted on a house 3 doors down, that the first real clue emerged. The footage showed Rebecca stepping onto the deck alone. At approximately 6:28 p.m. 1 minute later, a second figure appeared, smaller, thinner, unmistakably younger. The timestamp read 6:29 p.m. The image was too distant for facial recognition, but the outline, the height, the posture all matched one person, her 14-year-old daughter, Leela. For the next few minutes, the two figures were obscured by the deck's railing. Then, at 6:32 p.m., the second figure reappeared, sliding the glass door shut behind her. The first figure, Rebecca, never returned. That footage changed everything. What had been a family tragedy was now a potential homicide. The detectives replayed it frame by frame, studying every flicker of movement, every change in light. The sequence was short, barely 4 minutes, but in those minutes lay the entire story of what had happened that evening, or at least the part that could be seen. The rest would have to be uncovered piece by piece, through blood, fingerprints, and the fragile inconsistencies of human memory. As the forensic analysis continued, small traces began to emerge, each one adding weight to the growing suspicion that Rebecca Monroe had not simply fallen. Luminol testing on the deck revealed faint traces of blood, not enough to be visible in normal light, but enough to suggest that something had been spilled there and then washed away. Near the outdoor sink, the handle of a garden hose was damp, its valve still slightly turned. Someone had rinsed something recently, though what that something was remained unspoken until the lab results came back. When the lighthouse statue was finally tested, the results confirmed what Detective Sloan had already begun to suspect. Despite the spotless exterior, microscopic residue of blood had collected in the fine crevices around the base and in the ridges of the ceramic design. The blood matched Rebecca's type, and beneath that faint residue, the lab recovered partial fingerprints, small, delicate, unmistakably belonging to Leela Monroe. The evidence was still circumstantial, but it formed a shape that was impossible to ignore. Each discovery, though subtle, added another thread to a picture that was beginning to look disturbingly deliberate. The clean statue, the wiped railing, the calm demeanor of the daughter, the inconsistencies in her statement, all pointed toward the same chilling conclusion. By the time the medical examiner's full report arrived, the transformation of the case from accident to murder was complete. The wound on the back of Rebecca's head, circular and deep, corresponded exactly with the base of the lighthouse statue. The fracture was consistent with a downward strike delivered with significant force, enough to cause immediate unconsciousness and near-instant death. She had been struck before she fell, not after. The fall itself had merely been the aftermath, a silent descent following a single, devastating act of violence. In the quiet aftermath of that revelation, the investigative team gathered in the evidence room to review everything they had. The photographs, the autopsy report, the footage, the fingerprints, each piece connected in a way that no longer allowed room for coincidence. Lila's name moved from the column of witnesses to that of suspects, and though no one said it aloud at first, they all knew what the next step would have to be. Outside, the morning light spilled across the ocean, indifferent to what had taken place. The waves rose and fell in their eternal rhythm, washing the rocks clean, erasing the stains of human tragedy as if the sea itself refused to hold the memory. But inside the Monroe investigation files, nothing could be washed away. Every detail was preserved, every trace of dust, every drop of blood, every frame of footage, forming a record of how a single evening meant to celebrate life had turned into the beginning of a case that would haunt Crystal Key for years to come. The house was empty again now, the evidence collected, the echoes of laughter replaced by the sterile silence of abandonment. Yet even in that emptiness, it felt alive in a way that unsettled those who entered it. Perhaps it was because places remember in their own way. They remember footsteps, voices, the weight of what occurred within their walls. The Monroe Beach House would forever remember that night, the moment when innocence cracked, when love and envy collided, and when a daughter's unspoken turmoil became an irreversible act. As the file for the case thickened, a quiet truth began to settle over everyone involved. This was no longer a question of what had happened, but of why. And in that question lay the deeper tragedy, not just of Rebecca Monroe's death, but of the young girl whose name was now written beside the word suspect. The fall at Crystal Key was never really about gravity or missteps. It was about something far heavier. The slow, unseen collapse of a family under the weight of misunderstanding, silence, and growing shadows. The days that followed the discovery at Crystal Key unfolded like a slow descent into something darker than grief, a strange limbo where denial clashed with growing suspicion, and every comforting explanation began to crumble beneath the weight of evidence. The Monroe family, once held together by the familiar glue of shared memories, now existed as fragments orbiting a silence none of them could yet name aloud. Daniel moved through those days in a daze, speaking little, sleeping less. Every room in the house felt haunted by his wife's presence, by the echoes of her laughter that seemed trapped in the walls. The decorations from the baby shower had long been taken down, yet he could still see them when he closed his eyes. The soft blues, the tiny sailboats, the banner that had once promised joy and now symbolized everything he'd lost. Lila, meanwhile, had become a ghost of a different kind. She moved quietly, predictably, always polite, always still. To outsiders, it looked like grief, the stunned, dissociative kind that swallows young people whole. But to those who watched closely, there was something off in her stillness, a composure that didn't fit the chaos of what had happened. When she sat before the detectives for her formal statement, her eyes carried the distance of someone rehearsing sadness rather than feeling it. She answered questions with precision, but never emotion, and each reply, while technically consistent, carried the faint, artificial rhythm of something memorized. Detective Sloan had seen that rhythm before, not often, but enough to recognize it when it appeared. It wasn't arrogance or defiance. It was the quiet rhythm of concealment. And though the evidence against Lila was still circumstantial, every instinct he had told him that the truth lay somewhere behind that carefully constructed stillness. The challenge now was to prove it, to peel back each layer of fabrication without breaking the fragile line between truth and trauma. The first step came in the form of the lighthouse statue, that innocuous ornament that had transformed from decoration to silent witness. When the forensic lab confirmed the presence of both blood and partial fingerprints, Sloan had the item re-examined under advanced spectroscopic lighting. What they found deep within its ceramic grooves was more than residue, it was impact trace. Tiny flecks of hair, minuscule fragments of skull tissue, and a single embedded crystal of paint from Rebecca's earring. It was the kind of evidence that spoke in absolute terms. The statue was not just near the scene of violence, it had been the instrument of it. And yet, in an almost poetic twist, the lighthouse had endured the act intact, unbroken, uncracked, a symbol of false serenity in a home that had already collapsed from within. There was a grim symmetry in that fact, one that lingered in Sloan's mind as he built his case. The very object meant to represent guidance and safety had become the weapon that extinguished both. As word of the investigation's direction began to seep into the small Florida community, whispers followed quickly behind. People spoke in lowered tones in grocery store aisles, at the marina, outside the church where Rebecca had volunteered. They wondered aloud how something like this could happen, how a girl so young, so seemingly ordinary, could harbor the capacity for such violence. Some refused to believe it at all, clinging to the image of the bright-eyed teenager they'd once seen laughing beside her mother at the farmer's market. Others, more attuned to the undercurrents of family tension, admitted quietly that there had always been something strained in that relationship, a discomfort masked as discipline, a sadness mistaken for shyness. The small-town gossip fed on speculation, each retelling adding new details until rumor and reality became inseparable. But in the sterile confines of the police evidence room, the story forming there had no room for rumor. It was built entirely on trace and time. Every photograph, every timestamp, every fiber sample worked in quiet harmony to create a picture of precision. The narrative emerging wasn't one of sudden impulse, but of quiet resentment, the kind that brews slowly over months, hidden beneath polite silence. When Sloan reviewed the collected items from the Monroe home, he found himself lingering over Rebecca's journal, a soft leather-bound book retrieved from her bedside drawer. Its pages, filled with neat handwriting and the occasional pressed flower, chronicled months of quiet worry. There were no accusations, no bitterness, just the gentle heartbreak of a mother trying to reach a daughter who was slipping further and further away. In one entry, she wrote about Lila's growing distance, about how her laughter had changed from genuine to guarded, how she had started avoiding family meals, locking herself in her room for hours on end. Another entry described a conversation at the dinner table where Lila had asked whether her new baby brother would get a better version of the family, a question Rebecca had brushed off at the time as teenage frustration but later found herself unable to forget. Those pages, innocent in tone, carried the emotional weight the case had been missing, motive not in the form of hatred, but of alienation, of a young mind struggling with displacement. It wasn't a classic story of anger or rebellion. It was the slower erosion of belonging, where love turned heavy and unbearable. Rebecca's excitement for her unborn son, while pure and maternal, had become a painful symbol for Lila, a reminder of where she no longer fit. Each baby shower plan, each nursery decoration, had deepened a feeling she couldn't articulate that she was being quietly replaced. For Detective Sloan, those journal entries connected the emotional landscape to the physical evidence. The lighthouse statue was no longer just an object of convenience. It was symbolic, chosen perhaps subconsciously for what it represented. To strike with it was to destroy the symbol of stability itself. To lash out at the emblem of everything that had shifted within the family dynamic. Whether Lila understood that symbolism or not was irrelevant. The act spoke its own language. As the days progressed, forensic reports arrived in steady waves, each one tightening the invisible noose around the case. Luminol tests on the deck confirmed clean blood splatter patterns consistent with blunt force impact. The pattern analysis revealed that the initial blow had occurred near the sliding door, meaning Rebecca hadn't fallen instantly. She had collapsed before the railing, and her body had been moved. The directionality of the blood arcs suggested that whoever had struck her had done so from behind and slightly above, a position that aligned almost perfectly with Lila's height. The subsequent drag marks, faint but measurable, indicated that the victim had been pulled toward the railing post-impact, her body positioned to simulate a fall. It was a staged accident, clumsy, desperate, but undeniably deliberate. By the end of that week, there was no denying what the evidence was saying. The investigators gathered their findings into a report that felt less like a summary and more like a confession written in absence of words. Each photograph, each chemical analysis, each timestamp filled in what Lila herself had not yet admitted. The pieces aligned too neatly to be chance. The lighthouse statue, the wiped railing, the damp garden hose, the camera footage, together, they formed the shape of intent. In his office, Detective Sloan stared at the evidence board, his mind moving between fact and empathy. It was one thing to prove what had happened, another entirely to understand why. He had seen countless cases of family violence before, but something about this one felt different. It lacked the chaos of adult rage, the selfish heat of greed or vengeance. Instead, it carried a strange quietness, a sense of sorrow turned inward until it found no other way out. He found himself thinking of Rebecca's journal entries, of her patient handwriting, of the way she described motherhood as a lighthouse in dark waters. He wondered if she ever imagined that metaphor turning literal in such a brutal way. Meanwhile, the town's mood shifted from sympathy to disbelief. When news broke that the investigation had turned toward the daughter, it sent ripples through the community. The local news stations began covering it daily, their anchors speaking in hushed, somber tones as they replayed footage of the Monroe home, now a sealed crime scene. Aerial shots captured the isolation of the property, a lonely structure surrounded by water and silence, standing as a physical reminder of how beauty and tragedy often share the same view. Daniel, broken and disoriented, refused to believe the direction the case was taking. The idea that his daughter could be responsible for his wife's death was too unbearable to accept. He clung to the notion of an accident, convinced that the investigators were misreading the signs. He had raised Lila, known her laughter, her fears, her tenderness. To imagine her capable of such an act felt like imagining the son capable of malice. But as the investigation deepened, even his faith began to fracture. There were too many coincidences, too many unanswered questions. He began replaying his own memories, the quiet moments between them, the subtle changes he had ignored, and realized that the version of Lila he thought he knew might have been fading long before the tragedy occurred. When the arrest warrant was finally issued, it felt less like a procedural step and more like the turning of a cosmic wheel, something inevitable and tragic all at once. The officers who carried it out did so quietly, aware that they were not just arresting a suspect, but a child. Lila was taken into custody without resistance, her face expressionless as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. There were no tears, no outburst, only a silence so complete it unsettled everyone present. That silence would become her defining characteristic throughout what followed. The lighthouse statue, now sealed behind layers of evidence tape and stored in a cold, sterile locker, had become the centerpiece of the case. It was no longer merely a weapon, it was a story condensed into form. Within its polished surface lay the entire arc of what had happened. The jealousy, the misunderstanding, the snap of impulse, and the attempted erasure. It stood as proof that sometimes the most devastating acts are committed not in rage but in isolation, by those who feel unseen, even within the warmth of family. In the months to come, the phrase "the lighthouse case" would become shorthand for a tragedy that no one could quite make sense of, a crime without precedent, committed by a child against the one person who loved her most. It would spark debates across television panels and podcasts, each voice trying to explain what could drive someone so young to such an irreversible act. Psychologists would speak of attachment theory, prosecutors of accountability, and commentators of moral decay. Yet beneath all the noise, the real story remained painfully simple. A mother, a daughter, and a silent object that bore witness to the moment love turned fatal. Detective Sloan would later describe that object as the purest metaphor I've ever seen in a crime. A beacon that was meant to guide had instead illuminated the darkest corners of human fragility. And as the trial approached, the truth that had begun in the quiet corners of a family's home was about to be laid bare under the harshest light of all, the courtroom. In the weeks following Leila Monroe's arrest, the town of Crystal Keys seemed to fall under a hush that no storm or season could lift. It was the kind of silence that creeps into every corner of a place once vibrant, a silence born not from peace but from disbelief. The locals who once spoke freely about the Monroes now avoided mentioning their names altogether, as if saying them aloud might somehow bring back the darkness that had already taken hold. The beach house stood empty, its windows shuttered, its deck still scarred with the faint shadows of evidence markers long since removed. Nature had begun its slow process of reclaiming the space, sea spray dulling the wood, wind brushing away footprints, but nothing could erase the memory of what had happened there. The case itself had moved beyond the boundaries of the small community. It had captured the fascination of a wider world hungry for understanding, for meaning, for any explanation that could make sense of the unimaginable. News outlets across the state began referring to it as the Lighthouse Case, their headlines turning a family tragedy into a narrative of shock and spectacle. They printed photographs of Lila at different ages, a smiling child with ribbons in her hair, a shy preteen holding her mother's hand, juxtaposed against the cold formality of her mugshot, where that same face now looked expressionless, frozen somewhere between fear and detachment. The contrast was unbearable. How could both faces belong to the same person? How could the same child who once played on those beaches with her parents now stand accused of taking her mother's life with a symbol of love that had graced their home for years? The world wanted answers, and yet the deeper investigators dug, the more the motive refused to fit neatly into any box. There was no sign of long-term abuse, no hidden inheritance, no sudden trigger of violence that could be traced to a single explosive argument. What they found instead was a slow, invisible current, years of emotional distance building like unseen pressure beneath the calm surface of family life. Detective Nathan Sloan had come to understand that motive, in its truest form, rarely announces itself loudly. More often, it lingers in quiet moments, in gestures, in silence, in the subtle ways people stop seeing one another. When he reread Rebecca Monroe's journal, the entries spoke not of hostility, but of an aching love constantly reaching for a connection that kept slipping further away. There were lines that revealed her confusion, her guilt at not understanding her daughter's sadness, her attempts to bridge the growing emotional gap. Each page felt like a mother trying to keep the light burning in a home slowly dimming. There was hope in those words, but also fear, the fear of a parent watching their child drift towards something unreachable. Rebecca had loved fiercely, perhaps too much for a teenager who had begun to see that love as suffocating rather than comforting. When her pregnancy came, it was supposed to be a blessing, a fresh start for a family that had endured its share of silent distance. But for Lila, it became something else entirely, a symbol of displacement. In her young mind, love was not an infinite resource. It was something measured, divided, distributed. Every conversation about the baby, every purchase for the nursery, every friend who congratulated her mother only confirmed what she already believed, that the space she once occupied in her mother's heart was being filled by someone else. This was not the hatred of a child against a parent, nor the rebellion of adolescence. It was the grief of being replaced, felt by someone too young to name it, too proud to admit it, and too fragile to survive it. Over months, that grief hardened into resentment, quiet but corrosive. Rebecca's gentle reminders, her attempts to reconnect, her words of reassurance, all of it began to sound, in Lila's ears, like proof that her mother didn't understand her at all. And perhaps that misunderstanding, more than anything else, became the catalyst for what was to come. For the investigators, piecing together those invisible emotions was a task far more delicate than analyzing evidence. Physical facts could be measured, photographed, recorded. Human loneliness could not. But even loneliness leaves a trail, a series of small, almost imperceptible changes that, in hindsight, form a pattern. In Lila's school records, they found the slow decline of a once gifted student whose grades had dropped sharply over the past year. Teachers described her as quiet but distracted, polite but distant. She had stopped attending after-school activities, stopped bringing friends home, and when asked about her family, her answers were short and evasive. The digital forensics team went further, examining her online history and messages. What they discovered was not shocking, but heartbreaking. Lila had spent hours on anonymous message boards, scrolling through threads written by other teenagers who felt unloved, unwanted, forgotten by their parents. There were searches for phrases like when your mom replaces you with a new baby and what happens when you stop loving your family. None of it was enough to prove intent, but it painted a picture of someone lost, searching desperately for validation in the shadows of the internet because she could no longer find it at home. Detective Sloan spent long nights at his desk reading through those fragments, the flickering light of the monitor casting pale reflections across his face. Each post felt like a whisper from a person drowning quietly while the world kept walking. He could not excuse what she had done. Nothing could, but he could understand the shape of it, the slow descent from pain into something unrecognizable. And perhaps that was what made the case so heavy for everyone involved. It wasn't just a story of violence, but of missed chances, of signals lost in translation between love and misunderstanding. The prosecution would later argue that Leela's actions were premeditated, that she had planned her mother's death out of jealousy and anger. They would point to the cleaned surfaces, the attempt to stage a fall, the calmness afterward as evidence of calculation. But those who looked deeper saw something more complicated, an act born not from a single moment of rage, but from months of quiet disconnection. A child who had stopped being seen, and, in that invisibility, lost her own reflection. As the trial date drew near, the media began dissecting every aspect of her life. Old photographs were republished, classmates interviewed, neighbors questioned. Everyone had a theory. Some said she had always seemed off, too quiet, too observant, too detached. Others insisted she was just a shy girl caught in circumstances beyond her comprehension. But speculation could never capture the truth of what had happened between those walls, nor the strange intimacy of tragedy that can only exist between a mother and a daughter. Rebecca's sister, Claire, became a reluctant figure in the story, the family's public voice in a time when Daniel had withdrawn completely. She spoke softly at vigils and memorials, describing Rebecca's kindness, her laughter, her dedication to motherhood. Yet even she admitted that she had sensed tension between them. She recalled phone calls in which Rebecca expressed worry that Leela was slipping away, but had never once imagined that such distance could end in death. The human heart, she said, has an infinite capacity for denial when it comes to the people we love. As for Daniel, his silence became its own form of testimony. He attended the preliminary hearings but spoke little, his expression vacant, his body present only in form. The man who had once believed in the guiding light of his family now lived in permanent twilight, unable to choose between two unbearable truths, the death of his wife or the guilt of his child. He existed somewhere between them, where love and horror coexist in fragile balance. In the evidence room, the lighthouse statue remained sealed, its smooth ceramic surface dull under artificial light. It was strange how something so small, so ordinary, could hold such enormous significance. The technicians treated it with sterile detachment, yet even they seemed uneasy when handling it. It had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the contradiction at the heart of the case, a beacon meant to illuminate the path home, now forever associated with destruction. It embodied the paradox of the Monroe family itself, a household that had looked bright from the outside but was quietly breaking apart within. When Detective Sloan stood before the press for the first time, his statement was brief and measured. He avoided speculation, avoided dramatization. He simply laid out the facts. A mother dead, a daughter charged, an investigation that had turned every certainty into dust. But as he left the podium, reporters caught the faintest tremor in his voice, the unspoken acknowledgement that this was not a case anyone could walk away from unchanged. In private, Sloan often revisited the scene in his mind. The soft wind moving through the curtains, the scent of salt and sugar in the air, the faint outline of a woman's shoes by the door. He thought of how easily moments of celebration can transform into scenes of horror, how thin the boundary is between the ordinary and the unthinkable. The Monroes had not been special or cursed. They had simply been human. And that, in the end, was the most terrifying truth of all. The whispers of motive that surrounded the case would never form a single, clear answer. They would remain fragmented, part grief, part psychology, part tragedy, echoing through every conversation, every article, every late-night thought of those who had touched the investigation. The lighthouse stood as the physical representation of those whispers, beautiful from afar, cold up close, its light reaching outward while its core remained dark. As the day of the trial approached, and the world prepared to watch a child stand accused of her mother's murder, one truth became impossible to ignore. There was no victory to be found in what was coming. No sentence, no explanation, no act of justice could fill the void left behind. The question had long ceased to be about guilt or innocence. It had become something far more haunting. How love could exist so powerfully alongside the capacity for ruin, and how, in the end, both could belong to the same heart. The courtroom lights burned with that sterile, merciless glow that makes every truth seem colder. But before the trial began, before the words State versus Lila Monroe were ever spoken aloud, the tide had already begun to turn in the investigation. What started as quiet suspicion had now become certainty, sealed by science and time. The pieces of evidence that once whispered their clues now spoke in unison, their collective voice forming a single story, a story of deliberate motion, silent resentment, and a moment that would never be undone. The forensic findings had arrived, one by one, Each report another wave eroding the last of denial. The blood traces on the deck, the matching wound pattern, the fingerprints on the lighthouse, the water residue by the hose, all of it lined up with an exactness that could not be coincidence. Still, no one wanted to believe it. Not really. Even the most rational minds among the investigative team found themselves lingering over the photographs with a strange reluctance, as though looking too long might conjure the image of the child behind the crime. There was something deeply unnatural about it, not in the act itself, but in the hand that had performed it. Society is built on the fragile understanding that children are, by nature, incapable of true malice. They may lie, they may rebel, but they do not kill, at least, not without reason so extreme that it rewrites the boundaries of comprehension. Yet here, reason was both present and absent, not madness, not evil, but a convergence of loneliness, neglect, and despair. It was a quiet collapse that had gone unseen until it burst into violence. The prosecution gathered these truths like stones, heavy and immovable. The evidence boards filled with photographs and timelines, each pin and string drawing the investigators closer to a picture too painful to look at directly. They recreated the sequence of events down to the minute from the last time Rebecca Monroe was seen alive to the moment her daughter re-entered the house. The motions were almost mechanical, the step toward the deck, the approach, the single strike. It was efficient, not chaotic, suggesting not rage, but resolve. To some, that made it worse. Rage could be forgiven as temporary insanity. Resolve felt colder. It meant acceptance of what was being done. Detective Sloan spent hours staring at that timeline, searching for the heartbeat of it all. The moment before the moment, the thought that triggered the act. But no matter how many times he examined the evidence, the truth refused to take a single, simple shape. Perhaps that was what haunted him most. Every detail screamed deliberate intent, but beneath that clarity, he could still sense confusion. The evidence told one story. The human heart told another. It was as if Lila had acted not from a place of hatred, but from a kind of emotional vertigo, a dizzying loss of direction in which right and wrong had become indistinguishable. While investigators built their case in the cold light of fact, another kind of storm brewed beyond the courthouse walls. The media, insatiable in its hunger for tragedy wrapped in youth, descended upon Crystal Key with cameras and headlines that reduced everything to spectacle. They called her the baby shower killer, the lighthouse girl, the child without a conscience. Those phrases bled into the public consciousness, framing the story as something monstrous rather than human. But those who had stood in that house, those who had seen the photographs and read Rebecca's journal, knew better. Monsters were easy to identify. This was something far more ordinary, and therefore far more frightening. Daniel Monroe, shattered and silent, became the reluctant face of the family's ruin. The press hounded him at every turn, their microphones like weapons aimed at his grief. He said little, his voice hollow when he did. In the private spaces of his mind, he replayed that evening endlessly, searching for some clue that might absolve him of the guilt that had begun to consume him, the guilt of not seeing what his daughter had become, of not protecting his wife, of failing both at once. He tried to remember the last words Rebecca had said to him, the last time Leila had smiled, but memory had become an unreliable witness, reshaping itself with every sleepless night. Meanwhile, Leila sat in juvenile detention, a world stripped of color and texture. The cell walls were plain and close, the lights constant, the silence heavy. Psychologists visited her daily, asking gentle questions designed to reach into her mind without breaking it. She responded with quiet detachment, her words measured, her tone indifferent. But occasionally, in the rare moments when she thought no one was watching, her composure faltered. A twitch of her fingers, a flicker of her gaze, a shudder that betrayed the presence of something deeper. Not remorse exactly, but something like confusion at her own capacity to destroy. The tide of evidence had turned, but so too had the tide of empathy. As the story spread, public opinion began to fracture. Some demanded harsh punishment, arguing that age should not excuse brutality. Others saw in her the reflection of a system that fails to understand emotional suffering until it becomes too late. Letters poured into the police station, some filled with outrage, others with compassion. A few came from mothers who saw in Rebecca's story their own fears, the fear of losing a child not to death, but to distance. Inside the courthouse archives, boxes filled with labeled folders began to stack higher. Transcripts, psychological evaluations, digital logs, autopsy reports. The truth had now become a matter of record, dissected into evidence and testimony. But outside those pages, life had begun to decay around it. The Monroe home was sold quietly to a developer who planned to renovate and resell, though no one in the town truly believed anyone would live there again. Locals said the lights still flickered at night, that the ocean's sound around that stretch of beach had changed deeper, more mournful. They called it superstition. But to those who had known the Monroes, it felt like memory refusing to rest. Detective Sloan found himself returning to that stretch of shoreline often, long after his official duties were complete. He would stand at the base of the rocks where Rebecca's body had been found and watch the tide pull and release. The same movement repeating endlessly, unchanged and unstoppable. It reminded him of grief, constant, cyclical, eroding, but never gone. He sometimes wondered if time could heal such wounds or if they simply reshaped themselves into quieter forms. For Lila, he suspected, it would be the latter. Even if she one day left the confines of her cell, she would never truly escape that night. The act would define her, mark her identity long after the sentence had been served. The human mind, he knew, was capable of survival, but not always of forgiveness. In the months before trial, more evidence emerged that solidified the case in ways that were both scientifically definitive and emotionally devastating. A single footprint, faint but measurable, was found near the edge of the deck, small enough to belong to a child, positioned too close to the railing to have been casual. The pressure pattern indicated weight distribution leaning forward, not backward, the stance of someone exerting force, not losing balance. Combined with the blood evidence, it was the final piece in the mosaic of guilt. Yet for all its precision, the investigation could never answer the question that lingered in every investigator's mind. What did she feel in that moment? Was there hesitation, regret, relief? No science could quantify the complexity of that instant, the heartbeat between impulse and action. In the sterile clarity of forensics, emotion becomes noise. But in the quiet spaces between the data, Sloan imagined the reality, the ocean's sound outside, the warm light of sunset on the deck, the scent of salt and sugar, the soft hum of a party fading inside. Perhaps, in that instant, time had folded for Lila, love, resentment, and despair colliding until all distinction dissolved. When the day came to move her from juvenile detention to the courthouse holding room, the world was watching. News vans lined the streets. The sound of camera shutters filled the air like insects. She was led through the hallway in a pale jumpsuit, her wrists restrained but her head held steady. There was no defiance, no plea, only the strange emptiness of someone who had seen the end of everything before most people her age had even seen the beginning. It was in that moment that Detective Sloan realized something essential. The justice system could decide her fate, but it could never restore what was lost. The law could measure guilt, but not grief. The turning tide was not only in the courtroom or in the investigation, it was within the hearts of those who had touched this story. What had begun as horror had evolved into a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about the fragility of love and the consequences of silence. For Sloan, it was a lesson carved deep into his conscience that evil does not always wear the face of malice, and that sometimes, tragedy is the only language left to express what words cannot. As the final preparations for trial began, the prosecution readied their exhibits, the defense assembled their plea for leniency, and the lighthouse, that silent witness, was removed from evidence storage, photographed, and placed within a glass case. Under the courtroom's fluorescent light, it appeared almost serene again, its white surface gleaming faintly as though untouched by violence. Yet those who knew its story could no longer see beauty in it. It had become a monument to the complexity of human emotion, to the blurred line between love and destruction. The tide had turned, but not toward resolution. Instead, it had turned toward reckoning. What awaited in the courtroom would not be closure but confrontation, between evidence and empathy, between guilt and understanding, between a child and the world that would now judge her. The waves outside Crystal Key continued to rise and fall, indifferent to the lives they had framed, whispering the same eternal rhythm. Everything breaks, everything changes, and nothing, not even the truth, stays still forever. The confession did not happen the way movies or courtroom dramas imagined it. There was no dramatic breakdown, no sudden torrent of tears or shouted admissions. It came slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the tide easing over sand. For days, investigators had waited, circling the same questions, repeating the same patterns, hoping to find the crack through which the truth might finally emerge. Lila Monroe sat opposite them in the small, gray interrogation room, her hands folded neatly on the table, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The air inside felt heavy, almost suspended. Time moved differently there, slower, quieter, filled with the dull hum of the overhead light and the distant sound of doors closing somewhere down the hall. Detective Nathan Sloan had conducted countless interrogations in his career, but this one was unlike any other. The suspect before him was barely old enough to drive, her wrists thin, her posture childlike. Yet between her stillness and the silence that filled the room, there was a strange gravity, a weight that belonged to something far older than her years. She did not fidget, did not plead, did not ask for anything. She simply existed in that small space as though she had already accepted something the rest of the world was still struggling to understand. The room itself was designed for discomfort. The neutral walls reflected no emotion. The fluorescent light above washed out color, and the absence of windows made every breath feel recycled. Most people cracked under such conditions, the monotony of questions, the pressure of silence. But Lila did not. She answered what she was asked, in short, factual phrases, offering just enough to acknowledge the inquiry, but never enough to invite follow-up. Her words had the precision of someone describing a dream they no longer felt attached to. It was not until the third day of questioning that something shifted. Sloane had decided to forego confrontation in favor of patience, to allow silence to do what words could not. When people sit long enough with their own thoughts, he knew, the weight of them eventually becomes unbearable. The truth doesn't always burst forth, sometimes it seeps out through the smallest cracks. And so, he waited, letting the minutes stretch, his voice quiet, his questions gentle. Somewhere in that stillness, her composure began to tremble, almost imperceptibly at first. The faintest movement, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, her breathing slowing, her gaze lowering, signaled the beginning of what would become her first acknowledgement of what she had done. Her confession came in fragments, disjointed and without emotion. She did not use her mother's name at first, nor did she describe the act itself directly. Instead, she spoke of feelings of how she had felt invisible, how the world inside her home had grown smaller and colder with each passing day. She described the silence between her and her mother as something physical, a presence that filled the space between them until there was no room left for words. Her tone carried no anger, only fatigue. She said she felt like a shadow moving through her own life, unseen and unnecessary. The arrival of her mother's pregnancy, she admitted, had been the moment she realized she was no longer needed. Those words, quiet and measured, held more tragedy than any outburst could have. Forensic psychologists later described her mental state as disassociated awareness, a condition where emotional numbness replaces moral reasoning. It was not madness, not even rage, but a kind of emotional blackout born from prolonged detachment. Lila had not planned the act in a traditional sense. She had imagined it, toyed with it, visualized it in moments of anger, but never thought it real until it was already done. She remembered standing behind her mother on the deck, remembered the sound of the ocean, the way the light had fallen on the water, the way her heart had felt both still and loud at the same time. The moment had been quiet, frighteningly quiet, and when it was over, she said she felt nothing. No fear, no satisfaction, no immediate regret, just silence. Her words painted the kind of horror that has no blood or screaming, only an unbearable stillness. To hear them spoken aloud was to confront the fragility of human emotion, how easily it can falter, how quickly love can turn into something unrecognizable when left unacknowledged. The investigators recorded every word, knowing that what she was saying would later become the backbone of a trial that the nation would watch with both fascination and disbelief. But in that moment, it did not feel like evidence. It felt like a eulogy, one given by the person who had ended the life being mourned. When the recording stopped, and the weight of her admission hung in the stale air, Sloane found himself unable to feel the sense of victory that usually followed a confession. There was no triumph here, no relief. Only the confirmation of what he had feared since the beginning, that the truth, once spoken, would not bring closure, but deepen the sorrow that already surrounded everyone connected to the case. He understood now that Lila's guilt was not only legal but existential. She had not just destroyed her mother, she had destroyed the very foundation of her own identity. The act had made her infamous, but it had also made her hollow. In the days that followed, psychologists continued to analyze her confession, each report another attempt to translate emotion into logic. They concluded that her actions stemmed from a perceived emotional displacement, a term clinical enough to strip away the humanity of what it described. But beneath that sterile language was something much simpler. A child who loved her mother so deeply that the thought of losing that love became unbearable. The paradox was cruel and inescapable. The same bond that had once defined her had become the force that unmade her. News of the confession spread quickly, igniting the next wave of public discourse. Headlines called it chilling, monstrous, unimaginable. Television hosts debated her mental state. Commentators speculated about her upbringing. Psychologists appeared on late-night panels to discuss adolescent development. Yet for all the noise, no one seemed capable of capturing the real tragedy that her words, devoid of malice, carried more heartbreak than hatred ever could. She had not confessed out of guilt. She had confessed because she no longer saw a reason not to. The community of Crystal Key, still fragile from the shock of the murder, began to fracture under the weight of judgment. Some believed the confession confirmed what they had suspected all along, that she was beyond redemption. Others, especially those who had children of their own, found themselves haunted by her words, by the idea that a child could spiral so far into isolation without anyone noticing. Schools began hosting parent meetings about mental health awareness. Churches held vigils, praying not only for Rebecca's soul, but for Lila's as well. The tragedy had evolved into a cautionary tale, a reflection of the quiet crises that can grow unnoticed within the walls of ordinary homes. For Detective Sloane, the confession marked the end of the investigation, but not the end of his involvement. Cases like these did not fade icily. They imprinted themselves in the spaces between memory and conscience, resurfacing in quiet moments. Sometimes, late at night, he would think of Lila's words, of how calmly she had described the act, and he would feel a chill that no logic could dispel. It was not fear of her, but of what she represented, the thinness of the barrier that separates love from destruction when communication breaks down. The confession room itself became symbolic in the story that followed. Journalists described it endlessly: the plain table, the camera in the corner, the soft hum of fluorescent light, transforming it into a stage where innocence had been surrendered. For those who had been there, however, it was just another room, small and airless, stripped of everything human except the weight of what had been said inside it. It was there that the world learned, not just what happened on that deck, but why. And that why, though whispered in simple words, echoed far louder than the act itself. By the time her confession was submitted as evidence, Lila had withdrawn completely into silence once more. She rarely spoke, rarely reacted, and seemed untouched by the escalating attention surrounding her case. It was as if the act of telling the truth had emptied her entirely. There was nothing left for her to give, no remorse to express, no excuses to offer. In a sense, she had confessed not to free herself but to confirm what she already believed, that she had become irredeemable. As the pretrial hearings began, the confession played before the court in a room filled with journalists, family members, and strangers. The recording's stillness, its absence of emotion, unnerved everyone who watched. They expected guilt to sound like chaos, but instead it sounded like quiet acceptance. It forced those listening to confront an unbearable truth, that evil does not always scream, sometimes it whispers, and that the most devastating crimes are not committed in madness but in silence. When the lights dimmed and the recording stopped, the room remained still. For a moment, it felt as if the whole world had stopped breathing. Daniel Monroe sat in the back, his head bowed, his shoulders trembling, not from anger, but from the incomprehensible collision of grief and recognition. What he had heard was not a stranger's confession, but his daughter's voice, familiar, fragile, and forever changed. The confession room had done what it was designed to do. It had stripped away everything but truth. Yet in doing so, it had left behind something rawer and more permanent than any legal verdict could produce. The understanding that every tragedy begins as something small and human before it becomes monstrous. Lila Monroe's confession was not the climax of the story. It was its deepest echo, reverberating through everyone who heard it. And in that echo, something fundamental was revealed about the human condition, that love, when left unspoken too long, can curdle into something unrecognizable, and that even in confession, there is no real absolution. The truth had finally surfaced, but it brought no peace. Instead, it left behind an ache that spread far beyond Crystal Key, into the hearts of parents, children, and anyone who had ever felt unseen by the people they loved most. The world now knew what had happened. What it could never fully understand was how it had ever come to that point. The courthouse that would host the trial of Lila Monroe stood like a relic of another era, its tall white columns and weathered steps giving the impression of a place built to hold the weight of history. Yet no story embedded in its walls had ever felt quite like the one about to unfold inside. For weeks leading up to the trial, spectators gathered outside, as though drawn by an invisible tide, reporters setting up their equipment before dawn, locals lingering with folded arms and uneasy eyes, curious outsiders trying to glimpse a tragedy they had only read about in headlines. The courthouse grounds became a strange arena where grief, curiosity, and judgment collided long before the verdict had even been discussed. Inside, the atmosphere was different. It felt colder, sharper, as though every sound was dulled by the gravity of what was about to be examined. Court clerks moved with quiet urgency, stacking files and preparing exhibits. Deputies adjusted seating arrangements, aware that every chair, every camera angle, every procedural detail would soon be scrutinized by a public desperate for answers. The air carried the sterile scent of paper, polished wood, and anticipation, the kind that settles deep inside the chest and refuses to loosen. The trial of a 14-year-old for the murder of her pregnant mother was unprecedented in Crystal Key, and rare even on a national scale. It forced the legal system into an uncomfortable confrontation with itself, the need to administer justice standing alongside the requirement to acknowledge childhood, vulnerability, and psychological fragility. The prosecution entered the courtroom with a case built on forensic certainty, their evidence precise and methodical, each piece meticulously catalogued to eliminate doubt. But the defense carried something far more complicated, a fractured human being whose actions defied easy classification. When Lila was escorted into the courtroom for the first day of proceedings, the room fell into a heavy stillness. She walked with her head lowered, her steps quiet, her hands clasped in front of her as though holding on to some invisible anchor. The jumpsuit she wore softened none of her youth. If anything, it emphasized the impossible contradiction she embodied: a child in the body of a defendant. A young girl sitting in the seat reserved for the accused. For a moment, the spectators who had arrived expecting to witness a monster found themselves staring at someone who looked smaller and more fragile than their imaginations had prepared them for. The prosecutors approached their case like architects, constructing their argument with the precision of blueprints. They began with the science, the DNA analysis, the blood pattern interpretation, the impact residue, the footprint near the railing, the fingerprints on the lighthouse statue. Each expert who testified spoke with the detached clarity of someone who had spent years translating tragedy into data. They explained how the patterns on the deck revealed a struggle that had been scrubbed clean, how the wound on Rebecca's skull matched the curvature of the ceramic lighthouse, how no fall could have created such symmetry. They outlined the timeline captured on the neighbor's security camera, slowing it frame by frame, until the sequence became a haunting text projected onto the courtroom monitors. The jury watched with faces carved from solemnity. Some stared straight ahead, unblinking, while others shifted slightly, absorbing each new piece of evidence as though trying to find the humanity hidden behind the scientific precision. There was no sensationalism in the prosecution's presentation, just the cold logic of cause and effect. Yet even stripped of theatrics, the weight of their argument pressed heavily against the air in the room. The facts did not scream, but they were immovable. The defense, in contrast, constructed their case from the intangible, the labyrinth of emotion, isolation, and psychological decline that had preceded the tragedy. They spoke about the erosion of connection between mother and child, about the subtle signs of depression that had gone unnoticed in Leela's school records and online searches. Their experts discussed adolescent brain development, the inability of young minds to process emotional displacement, the ways grief can transform into resentment without being recognized. They described Leela not as a calculated killer but as a child, drowning unnoticed until the surface broke beneath her. Their argument was not meant to erase responsibility, but to contextualize it. They did not contest the evidence, they acknowledged it openly, but insisted that the act could not be understood without acknowledging the psychological collapse that had preceded it. The courtroom became a space where two truths were forced to coexist: the undeniable violence of the act and the emotional desolation that had shaped it. Throughout these testimonies, Leela sat motionless. She listened, but her expression remained fixed, as though she were watching the story of someone she no longer recognized. There was no visible remorse, no visible anger, only an emptiness that unsettled everyone who witnessed it. Occasionally, her fingers would twitch, or her shoulders would shift as if bracing against an unseen weight. Those small physical reactions became the only glimpse into the storm brewing beneath her stillness. The trial stretched over days, then weeks, each passing hour deepening the lines of fatigue etched onto the faces of those involved. Rebecca's family filled the gallery with quiet grief. Her sister Claire sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale, as though willing herself to endure the retelling of events she still struggled to comprehend. Daniel sat further back, his face drawn, his eyes sunken. He seemed to shrink a little more each day, collapsing inward under the unimaginable burden of losing a wife and a daughter in the same breath. The moment he was called to the stand marked one of the most emotionally charged points in the trial. Though his testimony belonged in Chapter 8, the shadow of it stretched into this chapter, because his mere presence as a witness shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom. He represented the impossible intersection of love and devastation, a living embodiment of the tragedy's dual nature. As he prepared to speak, the courtroom seemed to inhale at once, aware that the pain he carried might spill over into the proceedings in a way no forensic evidence ever could. But the trial was not only about emotion, it was also about public perception. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered daily, some demanding justice for Rebecca, others pleading for mercy for Leela. Signs waved in the air, headlines rolled across screens, and online debates raged with opinions fueled by fragments of truth rather than the full complexity of the story. The world saw what it wanted to see, a villain or a victim, rarely acknowledging that she was both, and neither, and something far more complicated than any label could capture. Inside the courtroom, the final arc of the prosecution's case centered on intent, the element that would determine the severity of the sentence. They argued that the act was premeditated, that the careful cleaning of the lighthouse and the staging of the fall indicated forethought. They pointed to her calmness afterward as evidence of consciousness and control. Their words formed a narrative of a calculated act, one carried out with cold clarity. It was a story that fit neatly into the boxes the legal system preferred: clear motive, clear action, clear consequence. The defense countered with a narrative more difficult to parse. That intent in a child is not the same as intent in an adult. That emotional breakdown does not follow the patterns of rational planning. They cited studies showing how adolescents can become overwhelmed by feelings they lack the maturity to interpret, leading to impulsive decisions that appear deliberate in hindsight. They argued that the cleaning of the weapon was not evidence of strategy, but a frantic attempt by a confused and frightened child to make sense of what she had done. As closing arguments approached, the tension in the courtroom grew thick enough to feel the spectators lean forward in their seats, their silence heavy with expectation. The jurors remained stoic, yet their eyes revealed the weight of the responsibility they carried. They had been given to narratives, one precise and logical, the other emotional and human, and were now asked to distill them into a single verdict that would determine the course of a child's life. When the lawyers delivered their final words, the courtroom fell into a deeper stillness than before. The prosecution spoke of justice for Rebecca, of the necessity to uphold the law regardless of the defendant's age. The defense spoke of compassion, of the tragedy of a young mind unraveling, of the possibility of rehabilitation. Their words were measured, their tones controlled, but beneath the formality lay a profound truth. There were no winners in this trial, only different versions of loss. When the jury finally left the courtroom to deliberate, the remaining people sat in suspended quiet. The tension did not dissipate. It merely shifted, becoming a dense, waiting presence that filled every corner of the room. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, as if even the light itself were hesitant to enter a place so burdened with grief. The trial of Leila Monroe had revealed more than the details of a crime. It had exposed the fragile boundaries that separate love from despair, childhood from responsibility, and justice from mercy. It had forced everyone, lawyers, jurors, family members, and strangers alike, to examine their own beliefs about innocence and accountability. And in doing so, it had become something larger than a legal proceeding. It had become a reflection of the human condition itself, messy, tragic, and impossible to neatly resolve. The jury's verdict would arrive soon enough. But long before their decision was announced, it was clear that whatever they chose, the story would echo for years to come, not as a tale of guilt or innocence, but as a haunting reminder of how easily something as delicate as a family can fracture beyond repair. The morning Daniel Monroe was scheduled to testify arrived with a kind of heavy stillness that seemed to settle across the entire courthouse like a low fog. Even before the sun had fully risen, the air outside the building felt different, quieter, more restrained, as though the world itself understood that something irreversible was about to unfold inside those walls. Reporters who had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the trial spoke in softer voices. Onlookers who usually gathered by the steps lingered with their arms folded and their gazes lowered. There was a shared awareness, an unspoken understanding, that the man who had lost everything, wife, unborn child, family as he knew it, was about to step into the witness box and expose the rawest part of the tragedy. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was colder than usual, as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees overnight. The sound of shuffling papers seemed louder, the echo of footsteps sharper, the beams of morning light through the windows harsher in their illumination. Every person in the gallery felt it, that sense of suspended breath that precedes a moment of deep emotional rupture. The trial had already been a slow descent into heartbreak, but this was different. This was the moment the legal proceedings intersected with unbearable human grief. Daniel entered quietly, his posture fragile, his movements stiff. He looked like a man who had aged years in mere months, his face hollowed by sleepless nights and the effort of carrying sorrow that had no release. His clothes hung slightly loose, his hands trembled faintly, and his eyes, once bright with the warmth of a family man, now seemed dulled by the endless weight of what had happened. There was something deeply jarring about seeing him, the solitary survivor of a life now erased, walking down the aisle of the courtroom toward the witness stand. He passed the rows of spectators without noticing them, his gaze fixed somewhere, indeterminate, as though he were moving through the world on instinct alone. The chair where he would testify seemed large for him, or perhaps he had simply become too small under the burden he carried. When he sat, he exhaled in a way that suggested he had been holding his breath for months, waiting for this moment with dread that shaped itself into something like resignation. The courtroom watched him with reverence, not because he held power, but because he embodied the deepest wound of the case, the wound of loving both the victim and the perpetrator. The questions began, but what mattered more was not the words themselves, but the way Daniel responded. Each answer came slowly, as if he had to sift through layers of memory and pain before he could speak. He talked about Rebecca with a quiet reverence, describing her as a woman filled with gentle optimism, someone whose joy radiated in small, ordinary ways, a laugh shared over morning coffee, the tenderness with which she spoke to her unborn son, the way she still reached for his hand after years of marriage. He described the morning of the baby shower, the glow in her eyes, the excitement she carried with her as she prepared for the new chapter in their lives. But there was more beneath his words, a trembling grief that threatened to crack through every sentence. He spoke not only of who Rebecca was, but of who she had been to him. Their love had been a shared journey, one carved through years of building a home, raising a child, enduring the quiet complexities of married life. To lose her was to lose the foundation of everything he understood about himself. When the questions shifted toward the events of that night, the courtroom felt the collective tightening of emotion. Daniel described finding Rebecca's body in slow, measured language, as though the memory had become something separate from him, a distant image he could not bear to hold too closely. He recalled the beam of his flashlight catching the curve of her shoulder, the unnatural angle of her limbs, the unmistakable stillness that replaced the vibrant woman he had kissed goodbye only hours earlier. He spoke of calling her name, of waiting for a movement that did not come, of feeling something inside him collapse so completely he wondered how he had managed to stand at all. His voice wavered only once, when he mentioned the unborn child they had already named, The gallery felt that moment like a physical blow. It reminded everyone that the tragedy extended beyond one life lost. It had taken two futures, two identities, two halves of a family that would never exist. As the testimony deepened, the questions began steering toward Lila, and the atmosphere changed again. A shift, subtle but profound, moved through the room. All eyes turned toward the defendant's seat, where Lila sat motionless, her face pale and unreadable. To the world she was a suspect, a perpetrator, a criminal. But to Daniel, she was his daughter, the child he had held in his arms, the girl he had watched grow, the person who now embodied the impossible intersection between love and devastation. When he spoke her name, it came out as a whisper, barely strong enough to carry across the room. His expression changed, not with anger, but with something deeper and more complex, a mixture of sorrow, bewilderment, and a heartbreak so profound it had no adequate counterpart in language. He described her childhood with a gentleness that left many in the gallery struggling to maintain composure. He spoke of her curiosity, her intelligence, her shyness, the way she clung to him during thunderstorms. He talked about the small moments, her collecting seashells on the beach, her hand slipping into his during family walks, the stories she wrote for school that revealed a quiet, thoughtful mind. But as he moved into the years leading up to the tragedy, his tone shifted. He spoke of the distance he had begun to notice, subtle at first, then widening into something he could no longer ignore. He described the nights she ate dinner alone, the time she spent locked in her room, the way she seemed to drift through the house like a shadow. He admitted, with a trembling voice, that he had not understood her pain, that he had told himself she was simply going through a phase, that he had trusted time to heal what he should have intervened in. That admission broke something open in the room. Daniel did not look at Lila as he spoke about her detachment, perhaps because the weight of that gaze would have been too much to bear. Instead, he looked straight ahead, as if addressing an invisible audience only he could see, a group consisting of his own regrets. His words were not accusatory. They were filled with a grief that came from recognizing too late the signals he had missed. Then came the moment the entire courtroom had been bracing for, when he was asked directly whether he believed Lila had killed her mother. The silence that followed that question was suffocating, stretching across the room like a taut thread ready to snap. Daniel closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and when he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been forced to live inside that impossible question since the night of the murder. He said he did not want to believe it. He said no father ever could. But he also said the evidence had become impossible to deny. The jury watched him with expressions that blended empathy with devastation. His words did not serve the prosecution or the defense. They served only the truth as he had come to know it, a truth that had broken him. In that moment, Daniel became the embodiment of the tragedy's full complexity. He loved his daughter, he mourned his wife, and he had been forced into the unthinkable position of acknowledging that the child he raised had taken the life of the woman he adored. No courtroom, no jury, no legal system in the world was built to hold that kind of conflict. It existed outside law and reason, in a space only grief could occupy. When Daniel stepped down from the witness stand, he did so not as a man seeking justice or retribution, but as someone who had been hollowed out by the weight of loving the people whose lives had collided in catastrophe. His testimony did not clarify the case. It deepened it, reminding everyone that the trial was not simply about guilt or innocence, but about the unbearable complexity of human emotion. The father's testimony would linger long after the courtroom recessed for the day, floating like an echo in the corners of the courthouse, in the minds of the jurors, and in the heart of anyone who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that tragedy never belongs to one person alone. It ripples outward, touching everyone who once shared a life with the people involved. And in Daniel's quiet descent from the witness stand, the courtroom saw not a man giving evidence, but a man unraveling beneath the weight of a story he never asked to carry. The day of the verdict arrived, with an oppressive quiet that settled over Crystal Key, like a dense, unmoving cloud. From the earliest hours of the morning, the courthouse grounds were filled with a stillness so unusual it felt almost ceremonial, as if the world itself were bracing for the weight of the decision about to be delivered. The sunlight, filtered through thin coastal haze, lacked its usual warmth, casting pale, muted tones across the concrete steps where cameras had been stationed for weeks. The crowd, gathering outside, appeared subdued, their faces marked not by anticipation but by something deeper, a kind of emotional fatigue that grows only in the presence of prolonged tragedy. It was as though the town, after months of dissecting grief and listening to testimony that cut at the deepest layers of human vulnerability, had reached the final threshold of what it could bear. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension, settled so densely that even the softest sounds seemed to echo unnaturally. The bailiffs spoke in near whispers as they prepared the room for the session. The chairs aligned in perfect, heavy rows. The juror's box, empty for the moment, appeared almost sacred in its significance. Every object, the polished rails, the wood-stained seal, above the judge's bench, the microphones resting quietly, felt charged with the weight of everything the case had come to represent. Here was where innocence and guilt would be distilled into a few words that would shape the rest of a child's life. Here was where a community would finally hear the answer to the question it had been emotionally wrestling with since the night of the tragedy. When the doors opened to allow the public inside, the footsteps that shuffled through the aisles carried an almost funereal rhythm. Spectators filled the benches with a solemn composure that made the space feel more like a chapel than a courtroom. Some sat with their hands folded, others with their eyes lowered, and many with faces tightened by the strain of what they expected would come. The tension in the air seemed to press against each person individually, as though the verdict itself held a gravitational pull. Lila was brought in shortly after, escorted by deputies who moved with careful neutrality. She walked with her usual stillness, her face pale and blank, her posture stiff with the strange combination of resignation and fragility that had marked her throughout the trial. As she took her seat beside her attorneys, she glanced up only once, her eyes drifting toward the empty juror's box as though trying to read some hidden message in its silence. There was no defiance in her expression, no fear, no plea for sympathy. It was the gaze of someone who had already surrendered to whatever fate awaited her, someone who had long abandoned the illusion of control over her own future. Daniel entered quietly, his presence altering the emotional landscape of the room with quiet devastation. He sat in the back row, as he had throughout much of the trial, his body leaning slightly forward, as if pulled by a force he could neither resist nor fully face. He had aged rapidly in the months since the tragedy, the lines on his face deepening, his eyes losing their brightness. His grief had not softened. It had simply reshaped itself into something quieter and more consuming. The verdict would not bring him closure. He knew that. Nothing could restore what he had lost. Yet the moment still carried profound significance, for it marked the final step in a journey he never asked to take, one that had forced him to confront the impossible reality of loving someone responsible for destroying his family. The judge entered, and the room rose in unison, the scrape of chairs echoing like a hollow wave. When everyone settled again, the doors to the jury deliberation room opened, and the 12 men and women who held the fate of a 14-year-old girl in their hands filed solemnly into the courtroom. Their expressions were carved from stone, giving nothing away, revealing none of the inner turmoil that often accompanies decisions of such profound moral weight. They took their seats with a measured precision, their gazes fixed forward, their hands still, their breaths shallow but controlled. A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly stifled by a stern glance from the bailiff. The judge addressed the jurors with the steady ritual of procedure, asking the familiar question that had presided over countless cases before this one, but never one with implications quite like these. When the foreperson stood, holding the paper containing their decision, the entire room seemed to lean forward in a single, collective breath. Time slowed in those few seconds, the kind of slowing that happens in moments when life alters its trajectory. The verdict was read aloud with unwavering clarity, each word landing like a stone on the still surface of the room. Leila Monroe was found guilty on all primary counts. Guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of the death of her unborn sibling, guilty of the intentional act that had altered the course of so many lives. The words did not erupt into gasps or cries. Instead, a haunting silence followed, as though every person in the courtroom had felt the verdict lodge itself inside their chest in a way that left no room for sound. Lila did not react in any overt way. Her expression did not change, her posture did not falter, and her eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the judge's bench. If the verdict struck her, she did not outwardly show it. Perhaps she had prepared herself for this moment long before it arrived. Perhaps she had been living in its shadow since the night she confessed. Or perhaps she had simply reached a state of numbness so complete that no external event could penetrate it. Whatever the reason, her stillness in that moment became a kind of haunting symbol, a manifestation of the emptiness she carried inside her. The sentencing phase began shortly after, and though the verdict had already been delivered, the emotionally charged atmosphere lingered with the same intensity. The judge spoke with solemn precision, outlining the legal parameters, acknowledging the exceptional nature of the case, and pausing often, as though aware that each word would be scrutinized long after it left his lips. He explained, with a deep and measured tone, that the state's laws required the sentence to account not only for the severity of the crime, but also for the age and potential rehabilitative future of the defendant. It was a delicate balance, one that required acknowledging both the gravity of the loss and the youth of the person held responsible. When he addressed Leila directly, his voice held no anger and no softness, only the firm neutrality that justice demands. He spoke of the choices she had made, the irreversible harm they had caused, and the lives left shattered in the aftermath. He spoke of Rebecca, of the unborn child, of the community forever changed. And then, with the full weight of the law behind him, he delivered the words that would echo far beyond the courtroom walls. She would spend the rest of her natural life in the custody of the state. In simpler terms, she would never leave prison. The sentence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. For a moment, it seemed as though the air had been pulled away, leaving behind only the phantom sensation of breath. Lila did not flinch. did not look up, did not search the room for a familiar face. If anything, she seemed to retreat further inward, as though the sentence had simply confirmed what she had already accepted as her fate. In the back row, Daniel felt something inside him shift. Not relief, not anger, but the dull ache of finality. The sentence did not bring justice or resolution. It did not undo the night that had destroyed his family. It did not restore what had been taken or repair what had shattered. But it did mark the end of a chapter he had been forced to endure with no guide except his own breaking heart. He remained seated long after the room began to empty, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the floor. His grief had no outlet, and his love had no place to go. He bore both in silence, as he had from the beginning. As the courtroom slowly drained of people, reporters rushed out to broadcast the outcome, their voices spilling onto televisions and phones across the country. Outside, the crowd erupted into divided reactions, some expressing satisfaction that justice had been served, others mourning the loss of a young life to a system that offered no redemption. The debate would continue for weeks, months, and perhaps even years. But inside the courtroom, where the echoes of the verdict still lingered in the heavy air, the debate meant nothing. What mattered were the lives forever altered, the fracture carved through the center of a once whole family, and the realization that no verdict, guilty or not, could ever fully capture the complexity of what had led to this moment. When Leela was eventually escorted out, the room stood still, watching the small, quiet figure being led away into a future defined by concrete walls and locked doors. She moved without resistance, without hesitation, as though stepping into the only world she could now imagine. The image of her disappearing through the courthouse doors would remain etched in the memories of everyone who had witnessed it, a stark reminder of how fragile the line is between innocence and tragedy, and how quickly a moment of unraveling can redefine an entire life. In the end, the verdict and sentence were not just legal outcomes. They became symbols of loss, of accountability, of the painful limits of justice. They represented the culmination of a story with no winners, only wounds that would take a lifetime to understand, if they ever healed at all. In the months that followed the sentencing, Crystal Keys seemed to settle into an uneasy quiet, the kind that arrives after a storm has passed but leaves behind a landscape permanently altered. The town moved through its days with a gentler pace, as if still unsure how to return to normal. People no longer gathered in crowds outside the courthouse. The media vans, once lined in restless rows along the streets, disappeared one by one. What remained was a community carrying a story too heavy for conversation, too tender for gossip, too tragic for easy understanding. The Monroe case had become something unspoken, a wound woven into the town's memory, present even when no one mentioned it. The beach house where the tragedy took place stood quietly at the edge of the shoreline, its once vibrant paint now dulled by salt and sun. The deck, with its view of the restless ocean, looked unchanged from the outside. But those who knew what had happened there rarely allowed their gaze to linger. The house seemed to absorb silence, its windows dark, its wind chimes muted by months of disuse. The decorative lighthouse statue, once an innocent ornament meant to brighten the deck, had been removed long ago as evidence, leaving behind only a faint circular imprint on the wood, a ghostly reminder of the object that had become a symbol of unspeakable violence. Some nights, when the tide rolled in particularly strong, locals would say the wind around that house carried a kind of whisper, a soft, mournful echo that blended with the sound of waves striking the rocks. Whether it was imagination or coincidence, no one could say. But the story had left an imprint on the town as indelible as the impression on the deck. Not dramatic or loud, but quiet and persistent. An ache that lived in the spaces between ordinary life outside. Crystal Key moved on more predictably. News cycles shifted to new tragedies, new controversies, new questions. The Monroe case, once the center of national attention, slowly faded from the headlines, becoming one more story in the long archive of American true crime. But for those whose lives had been entangled in its aftermath, especially Daniel, the story never faded. It lived inside him like an echo that refused to dim, a presence that accompanied him into each day. Daniel returned to the house only once after the sentencing, not because he wanted to, but because something inside him needed to stand in the place where everything had ended. The walk from the driveway to the back deck felt impossibly long, each step pulling him deeper into the memory he had spent months trying to outrun. When he reached the railing, the view of the ocean spread before him in a blue, indifferent expanse. The waves rolled against the rocks with the same unbothered rhythm as the night Rebecca had fallen or been pushed into the darkness. Standing there, he felt the weight of both love and loss press against him. He missed Rebecca with a depth that language could never articulate. He missed the child they had been waiting to meet, a life now forever unimagined. But the grief did not end there. It reached further, into the space reserved for Lila, his daughter, who still existed but could no longer be reached in the way he once knew. His love for her had not disappeared. Grief does not erase connection. Instead, it had transformed into something heavier, something shaped by sorrow and confusion, a love still alive but forever altered. He closed his eyes and let the wind pass over him, carrying with it the scent of salt and distant rain. He wondered how a family that had once felt whole could fracture so completely. He wondered how pain could grow unnoticed inside someone until it became something unrecognizable. He wondered, too, about forgiveness, not as a moral duty, but as a question with no clear answer. Could he forgive his daughter? Could he forgive himself for failing to see her suffering? Could anyone truly forgive what had happened? The questions lingered with no expectation of resolution. Some wounds simply existed, woven into the fabric of life without promise of closure. Meanwhile, far from the quiet coastline of Crystal Key, Lila entered a world defined not by freedom but by structure. The juvenile detention center where she was initially placed operated with a predictable rhythm, strict schedules, uniform routines, and an environment built to contain rather than nurture. Yet for someone whose emotional landscape had long felt disordered, the routine offered a strange form of stability. Her days consisted of institutional rituals, early morning roll calls, therapy sessions, educational classes taught in windowless rooms. Her demeanor remained unchanged in many ways, quiet, withdrawn, thoughtful in a way that suggested she lived more in her mind than in the world around her. Staff members noted that she rarely caused trouble, rarely spoke out of turn, rarely displayed defiance. Instead, she existed in a kind of muted stillness, as though her emotional life had been packed away into some unreachable corner. Therapists worked with her, gently urging her to confront the complexities within her, but she offered little. Not resistance, not openness, just quiet observation. She moved through her days without urgency or hesitation, as if living in a suspended state between past and future. As years began to pass slowly, almost imperceptibly, she changed in small, subtle ways. She grew taller, her voice deepened, her features sharpened into those of a young woman rather than a child. Yet the internal transformation remained elusive. Some days, a flicker of reflection passed through her expression, a momentary glimpse of someone trying to understand herself. Other days, she appeared lost within a stillness that no therapeutic effort could fully reach. The institution did what it could: stability, counseling, education, but no program, no matter how well-intentioned, could undo the tragedy that had shaped her life. She carried within her the memory of the act, the confession that had torn her world in two, and the sentence that had defined her future. Rehabilitation took on a different meaning for someone who had been sentenced to life. It became less about reintegrating into society and more about learning how to coexist with the ghosts of her own history. Occasionally, letters arrived for her, not from friends, not from distant relatives, but from Daniel. His messages were never filled with blame or absolution. Instead, they carried a quiet honesty, the kind that emerges only when grief has been worn down into something softer. He wrote about memories, not the painful ones, but the gentle ones. Moments from her childhood, stories she might have forgotten, snapshots of a time when life felt whole. He wrote perhaps out of longing, or perhaps out of a need to keep some thread of connection alive. She read the letters slowly, sometimes more than once, but she rarely responded. Words felt difficult, fragile, inadequate. Yet she kept every letter, folding them neatly, placing them in a box beneath her bed, as though preserving some fragment of her former life. Back in Crystal Key, the community continued to move forward. The tragedy that had once consumed every conversation gradually slipped into the quiet archives of collective memory. People rebuilt their routines, celebrated new milestones, and learned to navigate life without the constant shadow of the Monroe case. Yet its imprint remained, subtly influencing the way parents looked at their children, the way neighbors listened to one another, the way teachers observed the silent corners of their classrooms. The case had become a reminder that suffering often hides in places where no one thinks to look. The lighthouse, the real one, standing tall at the edge of the shore, continued to shine its revolving beam across the ocean each night. It had always served as a symbol of guidance, a safeguard for passing boats, navigating the dark waters. But now, to many in Crystal Key, it carried a heavier metaphor. It stood as a silent witness to a tragedy that illuminated something uncomfortable about human nature: the fragility of connection, the danger of isolation, and the quiet desperation that can grow inside a young soul unseen. Years later, those who had lived through the events would speak of the Monroe case not as gossip, but as a turning point, a story that forced them to re-examine the way they understood love, mental health, and the complexities within families. It became a cautionary tale told not with fear, but with tenderness, reminding people that tragedy often begins in silence, long before it erupts into violence. As for Daniel, he eventually left Crystal Key, not because he sought escape, but because the town held too many memories to coexist with. He moved inland, living a quieter life, surrounded by fewer reminders of the home he once knew. But he carried the echoes of the lighthouse with him, not as a symbol of loss alone, but as a reminder that even in darkness, there are beams of light that persist, sometimes faintly, but persist nonetheless. And Leela, in the quiet confinement where she spent her days, carried those echoes too. They lived in her memories, in her father's letters, in the rare moments when she closed her eyes and pictured the ocean she would never return to. The lighthouse remained a part of her, a symbol of what she had destroyed, but also, in a strange and subtle way, a symbol of the fragile hope that somewhere within her, healing might someday take root, even if it never bloomed fully. In the end, the case left behind a legacy woven not from villainy or sensationalism, but from the profound complexity of being human. It taught those who witnessed it that tragedy is rarely a single moment. It is the accumulation of unseen fractures, ignored emotions, unspoken fears. It is the echo of something that begins small and grows quietly until it breaks. And so, the lighthouse continued to shine. And the echoes lived on, in memory, in grief, in the quiet spaces where love and loss entwine, long after the world stops watching.